to buttress up the current government, right? So now you're talking about whether or not men are currently forfeiting their ability to form another competing government, right? Because that's what you basically just said. If a group of men vote, would you say they're voting that an alternative to voting could be rising up with guns and forming their own government?
Sure, there could be a lot of alternatives to that specific vote and a lot of alternative to government or isolation from the government. Now, I will say, I'm happy to leave you continue down this line of questioning.
Yep.
However, I'm not a lefty that's going to leave you walk all over me, and I'm going to control the direction of this at some point.
That's
but
fine.
I'll let
So I came across this, and I thought it looked pretty interesting. Jimbob and Rob Noerr collide. This time, they're looking to debate on should women vote or not, on the 19th Amendment and whatnot. And so obviously Rob Noerr is obviously going to be defending the women's right to vote, and Jimbob is going to be giving his position on why they shouldn't just have the right to vote. I like both Jimbob and Rob Noerr, so this should be a pretty interesting debate. I haven't watched this yet, so let's all watch together.
I have a request. Do you mind a request? Can you put up that screenshot again just so I can take a picture of it and then I get the exact
other argument?
Is that fair?
Yeah. Well,
that way you don't have to keep pulling
that up.
I got it.
I was going to bring that up right now. Yeah, you can. Well, I could keep it up just if you want to address any of the premises to clarify anything. I would love for you to.
Okay, so the first is adequate self-actualizing force is a necessary precondition for sovereignty. So I'm not a wordsmith. I'm a very simple redneck. So let's talk through this real quick. What this is saying in a language that I would understand is I have to have the ability I have to have the ability myself as a man to defend myself and to issue force to defend myself, my rights, etc., in order to have sovereignty. And by sovereignty, you mean in order to have rights and ownership over myself, my property, my land, my family. Right? That's
Jimbob. You can pull that down now so they can see you. Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just go through these real quick, and then we could obviously talk about them. Second is that sovereignty, which we already find, is a necessary component to liberty. When you're saying liberty, you just mean like freedom. Like that's how you're defining liberty there?
Yeah, freedom. I would go with your definition of freedom. That even however you describe freedom, however I describe, it still would fall that in line. It would follow that this is a necessary component.
Okay, so then I think the rest I understand, though. Rob is a progressive feminist. Maybe I don't know what that means. That's fine, though. So, all right, if you don't mind, we could start there. We'll start with this, and then we could move on. So I think I would disagree with the first part, or I have some questions about it. So let's take the hypothetical response that there is someone who is a man, but they're wheelchair bound. They're paraplegic. Do they fall into the same definition as being a woman then because they do not have the ability to use force to protect themselves?
Well, they wouldn't fall in line with a woman. They would be a man who would still rely on other men to uphold their liberty.
So yeah, clearly, we're not lefties. We're not saying they're actually women.
No. Even men, regardless of their condition, are still left to the mercy of other men with force.
Okay, so just to be clear then, if we're going to take that to a real world example of things that we're talking about, such as voting, should those men have the right to vote? That do not have you're paraplegic, you don't have the ability, you solely rely on other men for your defense, for the use of force. Should they have the right to vote?
No, I would take their vote from them.
So then you would only allow the vote for men that are physically capable of using force to defend themselves.
Well, if they have property and are able to defend their property, for instance, if that paraplegic can't defend his own property, right? Would you say he could?
I think there are possible ways that he could, yeah.
Well, could he in relation to how most men can defend their property?
He wouldn't defend it in the way without like massive technological assistance.
Yeah, he would need a lot of ramps and turbo boosters, right?
Hey man, Neuralink to a drone with a 30-06 might do the job,
I would. The question of how many lists of prerequisites we can list for men, I believe would be a separate. I think it's a fair question hypothetical, but I would start with the obvious: is that men in general, right? There's an average. Men in general, as a category, are going to be the ones upholding, enforcing, or taking over a failed government, and women will never be doing that.
Okay, so two things to say on this. One of the central arguments that I'm going to have is, as someone that believes in more of a small government and individual-centered approach to life, I think that although certainly I'm not some deranged lefty, despite what you might be saying here, I understand that there are averages. Like, for example, men on average are much physically stronger than women. We get all that. I don't have to argue that. But there are certainly exceptions to those average. And one of the problems I have with your suggestion here is because on average, women aren't able to use force, that they should holistically be excluded from things like voting. But men, and that's
More
why it's
than
important. Okay, fair enough. That's fair. But what I'm talking about is the exceptions, because what I take umbrage with is using immutable characteristics such as sex to deny people things like their right to vote. If you want to put a threshold on, like, let's say your argument would be this: anyone who has the ability to has the physical capabilities to defend with force their property should have the right to vote. And then I could argue that certain men don't meet that threshold and certain women do.
Rob,
that's a different discussion.
Rob, whether you think they deserve it from some sort of metaphysical virtue position is irrelevant to whether or not they can actually defend it. So you can say you have the right to this and that, but the fact is, women couldn't defend whatever they declared is theirs anyway. So it would be a lie. So what you're really asking, Rob, is can we just lie to women and say that they have the right to anything, even though they can't possibly defend anything that you're saying that they're given? So
yeah, I was gonna say that was so far the first flaw is when Rob speaks in this language of like they deserve this right to vote. You are going into like lefty territory here, where it's like you're under this assumption that people just deserve these things, even though, like, I get where Rob's coming from, and I do kind of, even though I get where Rob is coming from, I understand when you start going into that direction. Well, they just deserve this. It's like, well, then you have to explain, well, why do they deserve this?
For instance, let's go back in time at the construction of the values and the paradigm you value so much, the Constitution, right? Even before then, this kind of talk about how to declaratively state the position of your own sovereignty. Do you think a couple of people in wheelchairs and women, if they were the ones who found the papers and the documents, do you think that they could possibly defend it?
Well, it's
couple of paraplegics.
I'm trying to answer as honestly as possible. Like, it's difficult to think because we had different things technologically back then. But the spirit of what you're saying is certainly true. There needed to be some level of physical capabilities, and I think even more important than that, mental capability. Like the aggressive nature and sort of the the mentality that's a protector type mentality. I agree with all of that. The fundamental disagreement we're having right here is, I don't think that we should judge people as collectives. I think we should judge people as individuals. And so if we say there are certain metrics as an individual you need to meet to have things like the right to vote, I'm open to hearing that. I might disagree with them, but what you're doing is saying we judge all women on the average and we judge men on the average.
Okay, yeah, we can do it your way too. If we selected every single woman in the United States right now and we looked at them and we said, is she capable of defending herself and fighting against other men? And the answer is no. We can call the accumulation of all the individual ladies out there who can't defend themselves, who can't be self-sovereign, who cannot take over land or defend their own land. If we went one by one, and it turned out, Rob, that 92% of them were inadequate, that they did not possess the adequate use of force to defend their own liberty, would it follow that we can maybe collectively say, women, you're not voting? If there's some freak out there, who's a woman who's just insanely strong, and she even says, listen, you don't even have to lower your standards. I'll go into the army, I'll go into the military, I'll do what it takes to fight or whatever. If that freak of nature makes their way into all these various places among men, that's an exception. I don't think there's anything wrong with building a governing system that's based on generalizations that are demonstrably true.
Okay, are you for affirmative action in the current system that's set up, like racial affirmative action?
Affirmative action, like just giving someone a job because
Like,
of their.
for example, I'll give a real world example. The Biden administration suggested giving farmers of color that needed help, suggested giving them money. Is that a policy you would be for?
No.
And do you think that you have a fundamental disagreement with that policy because it doesn't give based on need, but gives based on immutable characteristics?
Well, it's under a false assumption. So that policy is as much a lie as your policy of securing female voting, even though they exchange nothing. I wanted to go to voting right here. Did you agree with my assessment of voting?
I certainly will, but I just want to stay on this issue real quick.
No, it's irrelevant because
I don't think it is, though.
It is. How are you going to draw?
Well, let me show you, because I think that those policies are immoral because they're based on immutable characteristics. If, however, the Biden administration would say the following: all farmers that are in X number of debt because of our lockdowns, we will give money to, and it turns out that number resulted in 99% of the people that got that money being black farmers, I'm more okay morally with that policy than saying, no, it will be based solely on race. Race is a prerequisite. I think if you share, and I would think that deep down you would share my outrage with that sort of race-based policy.
No, I'll show you why it's disanalogous. Would you like to guess how it's disanalogous before I tell you?
Well, I'm not going. Do you want me to guess what you're going to erroneously say? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Let's see. You will say, I don't know, surprise me.
Okay, what's in question right now is not meritocracy or effort. What's in question now is a descriptive truth of reality. The descriptive truth of reality in my argument is that women do not possess the adequate self-actualizing force to defend their own liberty and sovereignty. Whereas when you look at a farmer of color, whether or not they deserve money to be a farmer or not based on their skin color isn't reducing it to the necessity. Now, for the female reference, it's about necessity. If it's the fact, if you can't change the fact, Rob, that women don't possess the self-actualizing adequate force to defend their liberty and sovereignty, you saying, oh, that's not fair, it's an immutable characteristic, is like saying it's not fair a blind person can't be a pilot.
I disagree because...
So why the whole like black farmer thing is disanalogous is because, see, what Jimbob is trying to say is that women in general, pretty much even if you reduce it to the individual, can't outpower men. Yeah, you might have very rare exceptions, but in general, women can't outpower men. Okay, that's the whole factor with this voting thing, as Jim Bob has stated. The thing is with the black farmer is like, is there any proof that black farmers are better farmers than other races due to their race? Like, there's no evidence of that. And so when Democrats or whatever want to give black farmers, grants or loans or whatever like that, it's purely due to an immutable characteristic that has nothing to do with their farming skill. Like, there's no proof that if we have more black farmers, then the farming, industry is going to thrive. When the Democrats want to give grants to black farmers, it's just in the name of like DEI, like diversity, inclusion, and equity. So it's disanalogous.
You've already disproven your own point by saying you've already conceded that if there is a freak out there that is a woman that has the ability, from what your definition would be, the ability to use force to protect, that you're still okay excluding them because you're okay with policies based on generalizations. And so that in itself proves that you are not advocating a system of meritocracy, which again, if your argument was this, I think that you set some test up and says you have to pass this test to prove that you have self-actualizing force to be able to protect yourself. And anyone that passes it goes. And maybe 95% of men pass it and only 1% of women.
Sure.
That would at least be a meritocracy. That wouldn't be generalization.
Okay, but is the draft a meritocracy?
No.
Okay, so are you for egalitarian draft then?
No.
Why not?
I'm not. Because I think that generally speaking, that when it comes to forcing people to go to military service in times of a crisis, that it's okay to use the generalization of the poll that we should generally pull from.
Okay, I
But
see.
let
So,
me
double
finish.
standard.
But
Yeah.
there are certainly, we certainly look at it in an individualistic sense as well. So we don't say all men are eligible for the draft. For example,
Well,
we say if there are disabilities with certain men
if-
and if they're ineffective, like you know that, right? Like if
Okay,
someone's
hold on, Rob, generally speaking, okay, they have some standards, but if it came down to it and all bodies were needed, I'm not certain they'd include, the rolly guy down the ramp, but certainly people you would otherwise maybe say stay back on this. If the situation permitted, yes, the government would draft everybody and anyone who could do it, right? And you're saying, well, I'm about egalitarianism and it shouldn't be immutable characteristics. Whereas now you're saying the immutable characteristic it is to be a man, the traits to be a man, that we have thicker bones, we're stronger, we use brute force, we're more likely to use aggression, we're fit for war. That's an immutable characteristic. But if you were to be consistent, you would say, well, if we're going by immutable characteristics, we should draft all the women too. Just because they're women, doesn't mean they can't give it a shot or whatever. And the fact, the irony here is that if you were to open up the draft or the military to egalitarianism, you're going to weaken the force that you, Rob, need to uphold your sense of liberty and sovereignty.
I don't disagree. It's convenient for me then that I'm not opening up the draft to women. It's not an argument that I'm making. The couple points I'll make on this. One, if things got so dire that we were drafting anyone necessary, there is a chance that this insane government would be drafting women anyways. And there might even be a point where you would say, yeah, at some point maybe it would be necessary to draft able-bodied women if things were really out of hand, like we're alien, it's an Independence Day scenario where aliens are attacking and we need every available body. So that's number one. Secondly, like there's a difference because what we're talking about here with the draft is a situation where there is an emergency for the immediate protection that we're forcing people to do something for the greater good, which is to protect our country. This should only be done in drastic emergency situations, which would be very rare. That's different than sort of a positive right of saying we are restricting people's positive rights based on immutable characteristics.
You're talking about a vote?
Yes. And
so
again,
you think a vote is the right?
Yeah, I think that, yes, that you should absolutely, if you are forced to be a citizen of this country and to pay taxes into it, do you think that if you're forced to pay taxes into this country that you should have a right in the direction that the country goes?
Depends. What constitutes the ability to sway how the country goes is a different argument than whether or not you think voting is a right. Now, is it possible, hypothetically, to vote to remove your vote as a right?
Yeah. Okay. Women could theoretically, we'll get to this later when I sort of get to the things.
Hold on. Just one at a time. So if it's the case that you can use a vote to eliminate your own vote, which is, by the way, during the suffrage, the actual association that was promoting women's voting, they actually shut down the voting and blocked the women because they were about to show up and vote against their own vote. So if it's possible even today to vote in a way that removes your own vote, and you're saying, well, I don't believe in limiting people's positions or rights based on immutable characteristics. Well, you think it's okay if you can vote their rights away based on their immutable characteristics.
I don't think it's okay. I think it would be a bad idea.
It's an entailment that voting could lead to the removal of rights. By the way, the voting block you see today, you've heard it a million times, Rob, the increased female voting actually votes for policies and expanded government that limits what? Your liberties. So if it's the case, Rob, that you can vote to take away what you call a right, then what the hell's a right if you can just vote it away?
Well, what's a right is a difficult question to answer, right? Because we would say that there's questions of where our rights would come from. Do they come from God? Let me ask, since you're interested in what the definition of rights are, I'll ask you, do you believe that you have any rights? And how do you define rights?
I don't really believe in rights. I believe men have duties. And if rights exist, even if I were to take a pragmatic approach of being like, okay, I kind of know what you mean by rights, it still necessitates a deontological position that needs to be grounded, which is to say, do we have a duty to secure and defend rights is not built into the description of the right itself, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so there's a meta-ethical position that grounds a duty. But from my view, if you had a Christian ethics ethical system and all your duties were being fulfilled, the things that you call rights violation may not be consistent with how you currently see rights violation today, because duties would always supersede rights every time. For instance, if it were the case that it was a duty to limit liberty in the short term, and you used your voting method that you're defending, women coming in and voting, they can hypothetically and have voted in a way that removes your rights temporarily or something like this. So this is why I'm confused that if the thing you're defending is a thing called a right that can't be removed based on immutable characteristics, and yet you can vote on removing that thing based on immutable characteristics. I'm not sure what it is in the metaphysics you're actually defending that somehow stands above and supersedes the very methods you're appealing to, in this case, voting.
What I'm saying, so I'll explain. I think that the default position, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, I'm not a complete libertarian. So my belief is that the role of government is this, that it should be as minimal as possible. When I say rights, I'm saying each person has the right to the best of their ability to control their own life until it negatively infringes in a direct way on other people's lives. So I have the right to shove shitty fast food burgers in my mouth if I want. The government should not be allowed to come in and say, you can't eat those shitty fast food burgers. There are emergency situations that have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis where sometimes those rights could be temporarily restricted. Let's take disease, like things like COVID. Obviously, the restrictions are the pandemic. Obviously, the restrictions under the pandemic were gross, overreach, disgusting. I argued against them the whole time.
Would you call them feminine?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
they were authoritarian and feminine, of course, right?
Yeah.
But you could envision, let me just ask you, could you envision a time where the government would be justified in saying, look, temporarily we need to restrict the movement of people because of some sort of pandemic, such as if a dirty bomb was released over a particular city in this country and it was so contagious that it had a 98% kill rate. Do you think that the government has the right, or whatever you want to call it, to restrict people temporarily in that format?
Well, the government has the only thing that enforces rights to begin with. So it's not even a right. It's that the government has the capacity to do that, and you can't do a damn thing about it. Well, so that's the fact, right? So it's not like that's not fair, I'm going to hold up my sign and make a post, right? The reality, Rob, is that the force wins. And if force wins, the only real question is, well, what's informing how and when to use force adequately? Now, the reason I bring this up is because if it all comes down to adequate use of force of self-actualizing men who can defend or use aggression, we're talking about women. So I wanted to bring it back to voting, Rob. Did you agree with my opener that voting is a temporary transaction that a man, when a man votes, right, or a collection of men vote, what they're doing is they're putting aside their immediate brute force option and they're trading it for brute force option at the end that's enforcing the policies that they're voting for. Is that fair?
No, I don't think that's all that voting is, because I think there are men that are incapable or unwilling to use brute force that still vote.
Okay, gotcha. That's a good point. It kind of goes in my direction, is that, but for the men who could collectivize and use blocks of brute force, instead of doing that, wouldn't you say voting for them is an agreement to then use a voting block to influence policy, which on the tail end is buttressed and enforced by the threat of force?
Well, yes, but you are correct that no matter what we vote for, that there is, through the point of a gun at the end of the day with the government, which is how it's enforced. But real quick, before I leave you go, the word collectivizing is doing a lot of work there, because I think one of the failures in your argument is going to be that it's not just the ability to use brute force that ends up in the most force possible that's able to convince people to do things. There are other things that aren't brute force, some of which women might be quite capable of.
Manipulation?
Manipulation, or it's the negative spin on saying persuasion.
Right. Well, men could manipulate too, so I'm granting all the ways in which things could be manipulated socially, shaming. In the end, though, you would agree that a vote itself is a trade of one type of force potentiality for another, right? That's fair?
The word, define the word force. Or do you just mean like physical? No, I mean, do you just mean like physical aggression force? Or like, is there a form of force that's like financial manipulation? I could force you out of your home by...
will to power, brute force, not soft force, not manipulation.
So you mean like physicality?
Yeah, I'm saying that voting, the agreement to vote, right, for a bunch of people, the agreement to vote is an alternative to another option called let's get together and use threats of violence and actual force. It seems like a weird thing to not concede that voting is a conflict resolution apparatus in place of brute force.
It's not just voting, though. Right? Even if I grant your premise here, voting is a mechanism through which what you're actually talking about occurs, which is the idea to collectivize as a government, right? So if you go back to historical times, what governments actually began as, it was sort of a collectivization of people that said, hey, if we all come together and specialize and give a little bit up, then we'll end up better as a group.
Okay, perfect. That's actually better. So I would reframe it to fit your assessment, which is when a group of men, either individuals or collective, vote for a certain thing, what they're doing is instead of them forming another competing government, they're using a vote in place of forming a government to counter the actual government, and they're using a vote to buttress up the current government, right? So now you're talking about whether or not men are currently forfeiting their ability to form another competing government, right? Because that's what you basically just said. If a group of men vote, would you say they're voting that an alternative to voting could be rising up with guns and forming their own government?
Sure, there could be a lot of alternatives to that specific vote and a lot of alternative to government or isolation from the government. Now, I will say, I'm happy to leave you continue down this line of questioning.
Yep.
However, I'm not a lefty that's going to leave you walk all over me, and I'm going to control the direction of this at some point.
That's
but
fine.
I'll let
He's a strong, independent male feminist. I'm joking, obviously. I think where they joke around about how Rob's a male feminist is because he does kind of come through this lens. And I think if you want to tackle, I think you could defend having everyone have the right to vote without sounding like such a lefty feminist about it, you know? For instance, I would like to defend everyone's right to vote. However, I'm not coming at it through this lens of, well, women just deserve it. It's just a woman's right. You know, women should have power. So I don't know, whatever. You could frame it in a way where it's so for instance, with this whole brute force and stuff. Well, so are you arguing that only people that could use brute force or should have the power to vote? And if the answer is yes, I'd be like, okay, well, on average, you have, say, African American males, right, who are on average bigger and stronger than white males, Asian males, all these things. They're just bigger and stronger on average. So should we only give the right to vote to black men then? That would just be my argument. If I were arguing from Rob Noer's point of view, is this if it's about just the brute force thing, then should we just only give it to let's say black men then? What are you guys' thoughts on this debate so far? Are you finding it as interesting as I am? Leave a comment in the comment section below. Give this video a like if you're liking it so far. Consider giving my channel a sub if you're really enjoying it. Let's continue.
I'll let you control the direction for now.
The only way I can move along is that if
That's
you
fine. I'm
at
just
least
making
grant or concede that voting is a form of offsetting or mitigating immediate brute force among men, and they're appealing to existing government.
I don't think that that's the only option, but it is certainly an option to say that voting is a way to ensure that it's just not like pogroms or instant use of force to achieve what one wants.
Yeah, I would say it's a peaceful apparatus for men to use, where they appeal to a monopoly of government and force that's going to uphold the policies that they're voting for instead of them getting together and enforcing the policies they just make up, right? Instead. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I just wanted to get it out there what it actually is. Now, the question in my opening is, if it's the case that a singular man who's voting, and he's voting in place of the alternatives, I want to know what is the woman's doing? What are they forfeiting if they have no leverage when they vote?
Well, they do for two reasons.
What's their leverage?
One, we're going to get into what your definition of a threshold of force, because you've already said there are certain men that don't reach that threshold for what you would say. So one, I think that many women do meet that threshold. And second would be you've already conceded that there are other things other than just direct physical force that could lead to more force. You call just manipulation, but I think people could say you could also use the term persuasion that wouldn't have a negative connotation, which women would be able to have.
Did you say many women meet the threshold of, say, equal force to men in in a war situation?
I didn't say equal force to men. I said they would meet threshold. They would meet an adequate threshold of being able to deliver force. Because so let me control the direction here for a second. We've already said that there are certain men that wouldn't meet the adequate definition of force, you would say. Because if we remember, let me bring up your picture again. The first part of your, what are we calling it, a syllogism there? The first part of it says you need adequate, is the word you use, self-actualizing force. So because you've already admitted that there are certain men that don't have adequate, I think the incumbent, that it's necessary for you to define exactly what that adequate self-actualizing force would be.
Well, adequate would be able to would be the ability to shut someone down, end their life, or take weapons from them. Like, that's a good statistic. That's a more individual. You like individual things. It's the case statistically, the disparity between a man who has no gun taking the weapon, whether it's a gun or a knife, from a woman in high probability, like super high reproducibility, whereas a man taking the same weapon from a man is lower suddenly. And so if it's the case that the adequate use of force on average is that men can overpower women, how do we know this? Historically, a collection of men who organize a government and a nation, they defend it adequately. So invasion would be a good one. Defense from invasion would be another good example. If you paired a bunch of men next to a bunch of women, right? Even I'll ask you, Rob, if there's a country of who share the same values, right? Libertarian values, your values. One country, all of their army is men, and the other country, all of the army is women. Which of those countries are you going to live in if you share your values?
You're cutting out a little on me, but I think I get the gist of the question. I would say that I think that obviously the army of men in general, though I think that but let me say that that's going to be not a good analogy for two reasons. One, I think that gap is actually closing. I think your better argument would be not physicality, but because we're advancing to a point where technology through things like firearms, even drones, etc., make physical demand less important, still important, but less important than it was, say, in the 7th century or something. We could argue about it, but
let me counter that. Real
quick, Vic, I have a point to get to.
No, hold on. Let me counter that one thing. That's just reallocating the brute force of men to some other position, which includes machining, carrying large missiles around. The drone chicks who are in Burbank and they think they're playing a video game is really not a good hypothetical to use to try to equalize, to say that technology equalizes the sexes. It doesn't. Not even close. It's not even close to equalizing the sexes.
It's not a matter of equalizing. The word you used wasn't comparative. It was adequate self-actualization. So you take a clever trick there. When we're talking about self-actualization, what you're talking about is, as an individual, can you protect yourself from other individuals? And then the examples you start to give, we'll get to disarming a woman with a gun versus disarming a man with a gun. I'll get to that in a second. Other than that, the examples you give are, what about a military of men protecting against a military of women, which would be better? But that gets away from the point of adequate self-actualization. I would argue today, and remember, your point is it would only be a freak woman, possibly, like the fringe of the fringe, that would have, quote, adequate self-actualization of force. Correct? That's what you're saying. It would be like less than a percentage point of a percentage point when you say a freak.
But it's an exception to the rule, but we're talking about rules here. So I would ask you, Rob, if it is adequate, why would you choose the men and not the women? It sounds like you could choose either or and you'd be fine.
No, it doesn't, right?
Why?
Adequate's different than saying which would be superior. So it's a different question. Again, the
Rob,
incumbent... Now listen.
Hang on, guys. Hang on, listen. This is beginning to stray away from the topic a bit, and instead it's becoming kind of a pedantry debate over the use of this term, which is fair because you did give a formal argument, and it's fine for Rob to dissect that argument. But instead of us kind of arguing past each other, let us take a minute to define the terms to both of your satisfaction. So let's start with adequate. I think, Rob, that is your point of contention, correct? Okay, so if you're saying adequate force, I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. Do you just mean the ability to impose your will with force?
Yeah. Yes, and adequate is in reference, in this case, to other men. In fact, so if there's some sort of gradient of adequacy, this actually demonstrates my argument that reality is patriarchal and hierarchical. So there's hierarchical even.
Well, hang on. Before we get to all the descriptors, I want to just make sure that the definition is correct.
Yeah,
Rob,
do
you accept that definition of adequate? And if you don't, it's totally fine.
Yes,
right?
that definition's fine. I think that the descriptors he gives for it's where I'm going to have umbrage. So it seemed to be, if I may, it seemed to be that what he said was the way he defined what that adequate would be that can you disarm a man coming at you with a weapon? I think that is completely arbitrary. For example, if
hang on. I think you're right. But as far as giving, so one of the big kind of like debate games, as you know, is if there's kind of like tangential examples given to an on-the-spot descriptor or definition. That's why instead of us kind of going down the path of nitpicking the ideal of the definition, let's just get to the definition that both of us can agree on, unless we just can't agree on the definition.
Okay, I'm actually going to let Rob define it, the adequate, because
it's on you to define it.
But no, he answered a question that assumes he knows adequacy too. I'll tell you how. When I asked him the hypothetical between a country that shares his values, that is defended by women, and a country that's defended by men, him making the determination that the men are more adequate, he already has a sense of what that it's. So why, but why would you choose the men? I asked you.
That term more adequate doesn't even make sense.
Why
in this
did you
context.
choose the men?
I think men in general are superior in use of force than women.
More adequate?
I'm not using the term more adequate because it doesn't make, and I'll explain why. It doesn't make sense because the term you're using, which is necessary for your definition here, is just adequate. And so my contention, to stop beating around the bush, is this. A woman that is proficiently trained in the use of firearms, that carries that firearm with her regularly, is adequately able to protect herself from a man that is aggressing against her more than a man who is not trained in the use of firearms and is not carrying a firearm.
Okay, great. Does it follow that because that woman has the freedom to operate a gun and wear it and she's well trained, does it follow that she and other women are adequate enough to defend that right to own that gun and to have that gun on them?
Yes, that woman would be, if that woman would have an adequate defense. When you said that your definition is that like some attacker, that you have the ability to defend yourself from people that are aggressing against you. Yes, that woman, when she would have that gun, would have the ability to do that. And the problem is you don't have a good threshold. You've already conceded that certain men don't meet this metric. I agree with you. If we're looking at a world of 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, before we had firearms in basically any home that wanted one, like in our great country, that there was more of a hand-to-hand necessity to defend yourself if you're on your own from someone else. But in a world like the United States today, where there are more guns in this country than people, and there are many women that are trained very proficiently in using those guns in defense, and by the way, this isn't hypothetical, it happens all the time. There are women that fight off rapists. There are women that have fought off muggers. There are women that have killed burglars. So to claim that those women, that it's only a freak amount of people, you're implying here that there's somehow some need of physical brutality that women's bodies are incapable of having. And I think that the firearm training would be superior to that physical brutality in 90% of situations.
I got it, but you're looking at this in a very myopic way. For instance, you're granting them guns, right?
Sure.
Okay. How did they get guns?
What's it matter? How did you get did you make your own gun?
No. Yeah, no, but men made guns.
It doesn't matter.
Yes, it does matter.
No, I'll tell you why. Because you're talking about the self-actualization of force, right? And so let me finish. So now let me finish, please. Let me finish. Yes, if you as let me finish. If you as an individual created your own gun and say, that would be self-actualization, fine. But you don't get to say, well, in general, a man invented the gun and created the gun you're using. And so therefore, if you're a woman, that doesn't qualify as self-actualization of force. But if you are a man that did not create that gun, but by the mere fact that you have the same genitalia as the person that did, then you using that gun is self-actualization. Can you explain to me why it's self-actualization for a man that didn't create a gun to use the gun to defend himself, but it's not self-actualization for a woman that didn't create the gun to use it?
We're talking about the categories necessary, the distinct categories necessary for guns to even be possible, which is men exist.
It's irrelevant to the people that exist today. The woman right now, if a woman is born today,
irrelevant.
and yes, and I'll explain why. If a woman is born today, and then 18 years in the future, we'll say 21 years into the future, she's gone out with her awesome father hunting all the time. By the time she's 12 years old, she goes to the range with him every week. She takes self-defense classes with firearms. She is incredibly proficient with a firearm. It is not correct to say, well, because when the gun was invented hundreds upon hundreds of years ago, it was men that invented it. Therefore, she can't have self-actualization of force. Your definition includes the necessity for self-actualization, and when pushed on it, you immediately go to the generalization. You say, but other men, and that's why your definition's erroneous.
Look, if we agree that when it comes down to it, the woman has no capability of using the gun unless it's made by men, whether that's true for me too is irrelevant to the point that men are needed and are in a different category.
Can a woman create a gun?
If there was a gunsmith or a metalsmith, a woman who's making a gun, talk about a freak of nature. They're going to be in the minimal. We wouldn't certainly depend on women, right? So me saying I depend on men to make guns, right? To maintain guns, to facilitate larger scale military apparatuses and weaponry, right? If that's all needed for what you're defining as self-governance, right? And women on wholesale don't do it, can't do it. The thing is, I could do that. That's the difference. That's the difference.
The could doesn't matter. The could doesn't matter. It does not matter. With your definition, again, that talks about self-actualization of force, right? Like, so for example, now you're getting into a whole different ball of wax, right? Because you could say, there could be some dude that's like hulking, that's like one of the most badass fist fighters you've ever seen, but maybe he's not very bright, and he wouldn't have the first damn clue in how to create a firearm or how to use it.
Carry missiles.
Okay, but he wouldn't have.
There you go.
Let me finish.
Done.
He wouldn't have the first idea to how to create a gun or even how to use a gun. When it comes to his ability, but we're not talking about things that. No, we're not.
Yes,
your definition is talking about in order for you. It'll work better if you don't interrupt every 3 seconds.
Okay, sorry.
I was generously okay. We're talking about, for the beginning of your syllogism, that you have to have the self-actualization of force to have sovereignty. So talking about what people could collectively do in a military situation, you could carry missiles. None of that is relevant to your ability to defend yourself and your property through the self-actualization of force. For the idea that you had to be the one to create the gun, to have the self-actualization of force to protect yourself or your property is nonsensical. And even if we accept that premise, which I don't, women could easily create guns today through things like 3D printers. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't think you sufficiently answer or even give even a remote answer as to why, if a man who never created a gun uses a gun, that's self-actualization of force. But if a woman who never created a gun uses it, it's not self-actualization.
So why is it the case that even you hold to a threshold, right, between a group of men and women and a group of men and women going to war, and you'd always pick the men, right? If the threshold. So wouldn't it be the case that even if we couldn't get to the highest resolution of the threshold, we would agree just generally together that men have the adequate self-actualizing force to take over other men and women, but women have neither?
No, I would say that what we could agree to, which I'd be willing to agree to, is on average, and I'll go further than that, It's more than just average. It's the preponderance. That on average, the preponderance of men are going to be better at these things than women. But again, remember, the core criticism that I have of what you're talking about is the fact that you're using broad generalities and saying all men and all women. And I think that that's erroneous, and that continuously shrinks when we're talking about your premise needing to be, for your syllogism to work, the very first premise is that you have to have a self-actualization of force. And I think there are many
Rob.
competent women in the use of firearms
Rob.
that could defend themselves and their property because it doesn't just
Rob.
require brute physical strength.
Rob. So like let's take the Marine Corps or something like this. Now, would you agree that generally speaking, we'd have to say that the test to get into the Marine Corps has some standards, but ultimately it's like an invented arbitrary plan, right? Like, see if you can do this. If you can do it, great. If you can't, you can't, right?
Correct.
Even though, okay, so even the standard set up is arbitrary, right?
Yes.
Okay, but it's still required to get into the Marine Corps.
Yes, I assume there's base level tests. Sure.
Okay, so
Excuse me, sorry.
So I'm not sure why, if you're arguing, oh, well, it seems like an arbitrary threshold, but even you and I agree that the standard set for Marines shouldn't be lowered to match the capabilities or the incapabilities of women in the Marine Corps, right?
That's true.
Okay, so why?
Because what you're talking...
What is it about men that they can do it, but the women can't? Are we not generalizing that men, right, on net balance, men are capable, if they work at it, to, there's some percentage of men that could make it into the Marine Corps and pass the test, but there's no women who could do it.
Let me answer. It's bad form, but let me answer this question with a question. Would you acknowledge that the purpose of the Marine Corps, hypothetically, because this is a volunteer army at this point, we're not talking about a draft. You agree with that? Like people that are registering for the Marine Corps, the purpose is to have sort of the people that are really good at that. Like the best are people that are really good, correct?
Yeah, which is never a woman, right?
Okay, fair enough. But you grant that it would be, that's the purpose of it. Saying that one group of people is the best or amongst the best is different than saying adequate. Your argument hinges on the fact, in order to have sovereignty, which is sort of control over your life, right? Is how we're defining sovereignty, is basically how we talked about it, that you need to have self-actualization of force. My argument is that a single mom with a fucking gun, when someone breaks into our house, can shoot that intruder and will have more success than a man who is not.
So I think this is where Rob loses the argument. He doesn't understand the concept that he doesn't understand Jimbob's argument. He just thinks that Jimbob is arguing on the side of generalities, just based on immutable characteristics, just for like the sake of it. Well, men are better at this, and therefore, and Rob hears that, and he thinks like, well, that's not fair. There are some women who do this. There's some women who do that. And that's where he kind of, like I said earlier, he sounds like a leftist, because leftists hear that and it's like, and Jimbob is arguing that, listen, at the end of the day, we do depend on men for force. That if we ever have to go to war, we're gonna have to depend on the men, because the men in general, that's where the generalities come in, are bigger and stronger and more prone to like violence and aggression than women. And so it makes more sense that we would rely on the men in those cases. Even Rob acknowledges that. But when it comes down to voting, see, here's the thing. It's like with voting though. Okay, so listen, you could argue that giving women a voice, right, by voting, like vote, because women can't use force, the voting kind of gives them their voice. You know what I mean? The voting is what gives women their say in society, because they can't use force. The thing is, though, is that what Rob doesn't understand is what Jimbob is trying to say, is that if all men were to just wake up one day and we're like, yeah, you know what? All this shit that women majority voted for, yeah, screw that. We're just going to take it away from them. Women have no recourse. Women can't take it back from us. They would just have to suck it up and deal with it. Now you could get into, well, the constitutional law, the laws, blah blah blah, which it wouldn't matter if all men, including everyone in Congress and blah blah blah, were just be like, yeah, no, we're just gonna take your right away and suck it up, Buttercup. What can women do? There's no female army that could fight the predominantly male army. Yeah, if the women that are in the army now wanted to fight back against the men that are in the army, who do you think's gonna win that? Jim Bob isn't saying it's like this and therefore this is how it should be. Jim Bob is arguing it for more. This is the way it is, and therefore that's just reality, which makes the whole voting argument understandably hard to argue against. Like Jim Bob, Andrew Wilson, all their, even though I actually tend to agree more with Rob, maybe not for the same reasons. I think I could argue it from Rob's point of view without sounding all lefty feminist about it. But I think even with my arguments, again, it's hard to argue that, because that is reality. Because my whole thing with the voting thing is I don't like the idea of having a smaller, concentrating all the laws and stuff like that into a smaller group of people. I mean, isn't that why we have like the electoral college and stuff, to make sure that the majority isn't dominated by the minority? And so that's my viewpoint on it, is I just don't like the idea of concentrating the power into a smaller group of people opposed to a wider group of people. And yes, I know there are arguments to why concentrating it to a bigger group of people, letting more people have their say, is bad. And yes, I even know why a lot of times women tend to vote against their own best wishes. I understand that. It's just still, in my perspective, the idea of concentrating it to a smaller group of people, it just gets in a whole other thing. Like, well, then how are you going to decide? Like, fact of the matter is this: like, even though men can overpower women and women would have nothing to do about it, the fact of the matter is that in order to have a civilized society, we don't live in a brute force society. We live in a civilized society where we do have voting laws. And so if we were all of a sudden to decide, okay, a smaller group of people now are going to have the power to vote, and only these, well, now we're going to have to get into a whole new thing, is like, well, who's going to be this smaller group of people? In a way, it kind of reminds me of when the lefties, they're all about the whole, oh yeah, we should just leave it up to the smartest of the smartest, the scientists and the whatever, these smart people over here. The doctors, the scientists, the mathematicians, the geniuses. It reminds me of that. So I don't know. Like I said, while I tend to lean more toward Rob's side in the debate, I do get a lot of where, Jim Bob and Andrew Wilson and stuff are coming from with this. I think they make really solid arguments. So, but what did you guys think about this? Sound off in the comment section below. Give this video a like if you liked it. Sub to my channel if you really liked it. If you like seeing Jim Bob, if you like seeing Rob Noerr, I got some playlists on the screen for you to binge away and enjoy.